Oh, yeah. They're constantly going to change. If you will, go ahead and open your psalm book to number 990. Number 990. Bruce, since you're running late, I'm going to call on you lead prayer.
Number 990. Your words of music, your song that I sing, your melody, your harmony, praise to your name under the ring. You are the Lord, you are the mighty God, you are the King of all kings. So now I give back to you the song that you gave to me. You are the song that I sing. You are the words of my music. You are the song that I sing. You are the melody. You are the harmony. Praise to your name under the ring. You are the Lord of lords. You are the mighty God. You are the King of all kings. So now I give back to you the song that you gave to me. You are the song that I sing.
Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, as we come before you, we thank you for this opportunity that we have to study another portion of thy word. We pray that we study this in earnest, intent that we may become stronger in thy word, that our love for thee will grow, our love for one another will grow, and that we can be able to face the temptations of the world as we live out our lives. Continue to ask that you bless us. Give us all our sin. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
You will go ahead and turn your Bibles now to the book of Proverbs, to chapter 22 and verse 4. Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 4. I've been trying to figure out how long it will take me to finish the book of Proverbs at the rate I'm going, and I think by the time I'm 90, maybe. No, I'm joking about that, but we are moving slowly, but I've had several of you comment that you really appreciate studying the book of Proverbs because what Solomon says is so practical and so usable in each of our lives. So let's begin now with verse 4. By humility and the fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life. Solomon has focused on humility several times. He's also focused on the fear of the Lord, and he puts the two together here. One thing that I think would be valuable is chapter 15 and in verse 33. It says, the fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. Before a person can be what God wants them to be, they've got to be a person who has a humble heart. And in chapter 3 and verse 16, it says, length of days is in her right hand, and her left hand riches and honor, talking about wisdom. There's so much to be said about a person having, first of all, humility before God, but then also giving God the fear, the respect that he is due in our life. And then if a person does that, they will reap what they have sown. I think about Solomon, particularly as you think about this verse. When Solomon was a young man, what did he ask the Lord to give him? Wisdom, an understanding heart that he might be able to guide his people. Solomon did not ask for riches. He didn't ask for the death of his enemies. He asked for God to be with him, which indicated he had a fear and respect of God. What did God give him? All the above. That's about the best way to put it. But it says riches, honor, and life. And those are the three things that Solomon enjoyed. So in his life, he could say, I know that these are things that God does to bless us. Smart to know what to ask for. But that indicates a humility of heart. And I think if we continue to possess that kind of humility before God that says, God, I know that you know more than I know. I know your word has things in it that I'm not aware of, and I need to constantly search them out, then I think most of us would be better off. Let's go to verse 5 now. Thorns and snares are in the way of the perverse. He who guards his soul will be far from them. Notice now he talks about thorns and snares are in the way of the perverse. This verse is continuing the thought of what was found in verse 4. Because in verse 4 says, if you have humility and the fear of the Lord, this is where it's going to lead you to riches, honor, and life. But if you are going to pursue the way of the perverse, what are you going to find? Well, let me ask you, what do you mean thorns and snares? Problems? What are they literally? No, I'm talking about literally what are thorns and snares. Okay? I remember as a teenager, my father was a car dealer, and he traded, like the car dealer in Nashville says, for anything that doesn't eat. The difference was my daddy would trade for something that did eat. But he traded up a motorcycle one time, and I decided I was going to ride down this old log road. But the log road had grown up since the time that I was a young boy. And guess what I ran into? Briars, which had thorns on them. And I tell you, those things can be really painful and hurtful. Enough to where you let the motorcycle go and you stop where you're at. And the snares also are things that can trap you and catch you. But he said those are the things that are in the way of the perverse. The way of the transgressor is hard. I find myself, whenever I look at the newspaper and I find people who are pursuing sinful paths, what does their life generally reflect? Hardship. Maybe a man is an alcoholic, and what does he find in his family? Broken family, health problems. Sometimes they've been involved in accidents and they lose everything they've got because they've been driving while under the influence. The person who chooses to do what is wrong will find life to be difficult. The Bible talks about the pleasures of sin for a season. They only last for a little while. The young man that asked his father for that portion of the inheritance that fell to him, and he went and he wasted it in riotous living in a foreign country, what happened real soon? He had nothing. He was broke. He wanted to eat what the pigs were eating, and nobody would give him anything. The way of the transgressor is hard. Thorns and snares are in the way of the perverse. But notice carefully here. He who guards his soul will be far from them. How does that work? Okay, you guard your soul with a Christian armor. If I know that this pathway, let's say now I go back there and I'm going to ride a motorcycle again, do you think I'm going to go down that same pathway again without checking? Well, I've learned the lesson. And I think ideally most of us should be able to look at the lives of others and learn by the choices they make how, when your parents are talking to you and trying to tell you the difference between right and wrong, and you're dealing with them, you in your mind say, oh, I think I know as much as they know. But what do your parents do? They'll tell you about this person who did this person who did that, how their lives turned out. And what they're trying to do is to get you to learn from somebody else's mistakes. If we did that, we'd be much, much better off. And let me give you a couple passages here. Chapter 13 and verse 15 says, good understanding gains favor, but the way of the unfaithful or the transgressor is hard. And then in chapter 15 and verse 19, it says, the way of the lazy man is like a hedge of thorns, but the way of the upright is a highway. So you're talking about the good things. Now, verse 6. I'd imagine several of you probably say, okay, I've been waiting till we got to verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he will not depart from it. What do you know about this verse? Okay. Takes a long time for a child to get old. Okay. Before we get to application of this as a rule, let's notice a few things, because whenever I bring this up, many people will all say, okay, let's talk about those who've gone astray. Let's talk about what the verse says, first of all. Train up a child. Before you go any further, train up a child. How do you do that? By example. In other words, let that child see you do the things that you want that child to put in their life. That's a very good point. Instruction and correction. What does Ephesians 6 and verse 4 say? Fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath. You were close. You're in verses 1 through 3. Fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but nurture them in the chastening and the admonition of the Lord. Nurture them, to bring them up, to raise them, to guide them direction. But then he says that the training and the admonition of the Lord, one is corporeal punishment. What's that? That's physical discipline. And then admonition, what's that? Encouragement or words. I learned a lot from both kinds of discipline of my parents. I learned a lot from the physical discipline. I learned that I was supposed to sit still in church from my mother giving me a switching in between, the prayer, and she would carry me outside, and she got to where she was having to jump up to get the switches off the trees because she'd already got all the low limbs. But I know what it means to be disciplined physically. You think it gets your attention? It does. I mean, it got my attention. But then you have also the admonition. And that's where you talk to your children. Now, just a question. How many of you would have preferred the switching to the talking? Sometimes, how long could the talks last? A long time. And some of us got both, One wasn't good enough. You had to have both of them. But, well, a preacher's child always is going to get book, chapter, and verse, as my boys can tell. Amy's married to one of them, and, I don't know if Micah gives you the book, chapter, and verse, but he can tell you all the words that I said as raising your children. But the fact is that training up a child is involved in guiding and directing their understanding, their knowledge, and that's the first part of it. And it says, in the way that he should go. Does that have any application to verses 4 and 5? Look back up to verses 4 and 5. Okay? Humility, fear of the Lord will bring you riches and honor and life. But what about that man who chooses to go the perverse way? He's going to have thorns and snares. Well, you train the child in the right way to go, the way that he should go. Then it says, when he is old. No, when he's old. Mm-hmm. They were a lot smarter than I gave them credit for, especially when I was a teenager. Somebody? Well, the thing about it is, when you get where they were then, you know what they knew, and that's why you say what you say, is because they knew what they were talking about then. You didn't think so, but now you know that what they're saying is true. Mm-hmm. And the old phrase is, you pay for your raising. Well, let me offer you some other passages that I think are really helpful here. These are some good parallel passages. Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19 says, for I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him. Now, did Abraham do a good job of raising Isaac? Was Isaac a perfect young man? No. But did he do a good job of raising him? Because the Lord could bring upon Isaac all that he promised because of the job that he did. Well, let me give you another passage I think is helpful. The book of Deuteronomy, and chapter 4 and verse 9, it says, only take heed to yourself and diligently keep yourself from the things which your eyes have seen, and test lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life, and teach them to your children and to your grandchildren. That's an interesting concept there. When he says, train up a child in the way he should go, whose job is that? Parents and grandparents. Do grandparents have a tremendous impact on the choices that their grandchildren will choose? You know, sometimes you live with your parents and you see some of their flaws and you see some of their hypocrisy. That's being real. But your grandparents often occupy a little bit different relationship in your life. Because just like sometimes the grandparents, how much bad did they see in their grandchildren? Little to none. But by a converse, how much bad do the grandchildren see in the grandparents? Y'all never thought about that, had you? Okay, Joe's got a good point. He said his grandparents had as great of impact on him or more than his parents did. More. I had a grandfather served as an elder for many years. And he probably had a great influence on me choosing to be a gospel preacher. And I remember I started preaching when I was 16, and we called him Papa Lyman. That was what all the grandkids called him. And he would say, now, Tony, if you're not going to preach the Bible, don't get in the pulpit. Don't even get in there. Don't even, if you're not going to preach the Bible. And of course, his other thing was, he'd say, I want you to see the whole before you see the parts. I want you to see the whole Bible as a message. Well, I really appreciated that. I'm going to tell you something else about my grandfather. He cried a lot. And I don't know if that was age related or what, but I saw him shed a lot of tears. Most of the tears I saw him shed was for the church. And do you think that makes an impact on a person? I do. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. And that's the way. Now, here's a question. Is this a 100% truth that it is always will happen? Why not? Children are different. There's other influences besides the parents. Some of them you can control, some of them you can't. We all sin ourselves. And then you have free will. Just as much as you can choose to do right, they can choose to do wrong. And someone says, but if you just did good enough job of training your children, they would not depart from it. How many apostles did Jesus choose? 12. Well, he chose 13 if you count Matthias. But while he was doing his personal ministry, how many did he choose? 12 of them. How many of them remained faithful? 11. How many of them failed? All of them. Do you remember what the Lord said the night he was going to be betrayed? This night, all of you will depart from me. But then he's going to talk to Peter, you're going to deny me. But one departed, it apparently never to come back, in Judas. So if you start saying, well, if you did a good enough job of rearing your children, you wouldn't lose any. What about Jesus? Perfect. You had the free will of Judas, who was presented with a choice of money or the Lord, and what did he choose? Chose the money. And the reason why, because he had an affinity for that all along. So I think it's important that we understand that parents, what should you take from this verse? Do the best that you can and pray for them. And as best as you can, try to control the influences. Now, once they get to be adults, how easy is it to control your adult friends' influences? It's just next to impossible. Yeah. Well, you don't know what kind of situations that they've gone through in their lives. But as you look at all of this, I would go back to this phrase that you begin with, train up a child. And for those of you who are young parents, that's one of the most important choices you will ever make in life, is to try to set that concrete before it gets hard. That's absolutely true. Absolutely true. Oh, no, it doesn't. You know you were taught correctly. Well, let me ask you one question. We often use the prodigal son as an example of poor choice making. What do you know about the prodigal son? He came back. And that's important for us to understand. I have seen children who've actually left their parents. They have buried their mom and dad. And then later on in life have said, you know what? I have made a terrible decision in my life, and I'm going to fix it now. And so maybe I can see mom and dad in eternity. And as long as there is life, there's hope. And I think that's what you continue to do, is let them know that you have the best interest for them at heart. Never give up. Well, if you're a parent, you never will give up. That's a fact of life. Okay, let's go to verse 7. The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower as a servant to the lender. Now, that also is another main aspect of life. The rich rules over the poor. How does that happen? Because of the borrower is a servant to the lender. When we see this today, what do we tend to think of? We think of borrowing money. Okay, we owe ourselves to the bank. How much, when you think about borrowing money today, for what kind of things are people borrowing money? Something they don't need? Everything. Hey, we'll borrow money to buy a television set. We'll borrow money to go on a vacation. We'll borrow money to buy Christmas. With just all kinds of things we'll borrow money for. And it's like the commercial it's on a few years ago. There's a guy riding a little lawnmower in front of his yard, and he says, I've got a nice house, I got all this stuff, and he's riding the lawnmower, and he says, I'm up to dead in my eyeballs, somebody help me. This man was recognizing what our society has become. We have become a debt-ridden society.
You've heard me say this before. We will borrow money that we can't afford to buy something we don't need to impress somebody we don't like.
Okay.
Our society has become so much in debt. It's become a form of slavery. And we deny, people deny that it is a form of slavery. They become enslaved.
That was the point I was going to draw out here. What does it mean to be a borrower is a servant to the lender? Well, let me take you to some scripture which I think could be helpful. Let's go to the book of Nehemiah, chapter 5 and verse 4. He said, there were also those who said, we borrowed money for the king's tax on our land and vineyards. They had borrowed money to pay their taxes. And they said, we can't work because we're, on building the wall because we're so in debt to pay our taxes, we don't have any time to work. We're just having to work all of our time just to pay our taxes. In Matthew chapter 18 and verse 25, it says, but he was not able to pay. His master commanded that he be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and that payment be made. One of the things is that people would be sold into slavery because of the debts that they had acquired. Romans chapter 13 and verse 8 says, owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves one another has fulfilled the law. Now, the Bible recognizes the concept of borrowing, but can it get out of hand? Can a nation's borrowing get out of hand? When you get where you can't afford to pay the interest, then you're in trouble. Well, if you look at what Solomon is saying here, the rich rules over the poor. Somebody says, I don't want the rich people ruling over me. There's a really good solution to that is stop borrowing from them. Live on what you make. Try to be able to survive. Now, there are things that people cannot get by without doing it. But we can do with less than what we have. And if you've got to borrow money to do it, then maybe you need to rethink that as well. Okay, let's go to verse 8. He who sows iniquity will reap sorrow, and the rod of his anger will fail. A man who sows iniquity. What does the Bible teach about sowing and reaping? Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8, where he says, do not be deceived, God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that he'll also reap. Now, before I get to verse 8, if you plant corn, what are you going to get? You're going to get corn. And if you plant iniquity, what are you going to get? You're going to get sorrow. Galatians 6, verse 8 says, he that sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. In this, he's trying to persuade them the importance of doing that. Job chapter 4 and verse 8 says, even this I have seen, those who plow in iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. And then Hosea chapter 8 and verse 7 says, they sow to the wind and they reap the whirlwind. That's an interesting concept, because when you think about the law of sowing and reaping, if you sow one kernel of corn, how many kernels do you expect to get? A bunch. You hope that that stalk grows up and has several ears of corn on it, and on each of those ears, you hope there's a lot of kernels. So you reap in proportion to what you sow, but you always reap more than you generally reap more than what you sow. So he that sows in iniquity will reap sorrow. If I sow much, will I reap much? And so the latter part of this verse is a little bit difficult. It says that he may not always get what he seeks. The rod of his anger will fail. I've tried to think about how that would be applied. And I think about a couple of my friends. When I guess I was a junior in high school, we went out to play tennis, and they got angry at each other. And one of these young guys who'd always just get in a fight at the drop of a hat was picking on this other guy who was a farmer's son, and he decided he wanted to go out and whip him. And guess what happened? He got whipped. That farmer's boy was not a fighter at all, but he was going to protect himself. And he bloodied that boy's nose pretty good. In fact, there was, he walked off the tennis court crying with blood dripping and tears dripping. And he thought that what he was going to do was, he was in charge. The rod of his anger failed. Sometimes people who sow iniquity think, I'm going to do what I want to do. Nobody can stop me. That can apply to individuals as well as nations as well. I think Mr. Putin probably thought that it would be a very easy pushover to go into the Ukraine. He's found out it's been a little bit different, that there were people there who didn't want him. And how long is it going to last? How will it end? I'm not a prophet or a son of a prophet, but I know that he's probably found out things were much different than he thought they were. Okay, let's go to verse 9. He who has a generous eye will be blessed, for he gives of his bread to the poor. Generous eye. First of all, why does he call it a generous eye? You see it first. You know, here's a person, you remember when you have the parable of the Good Samaritan, and you have the priest and the Levite? What about the man that's over there that's been beaten and robbed? Why did they pass by on the other side? I don't get involved with that. I don't, you know, that guy over there, let him take care of himself. He shouldn't have been over there on that side anyway. You know, in his mind, all kinds of reasons. The eye has to do with outlook, perception, the way you look at people. But the Samaritan came and saw the man's needs, and then he did something. And the generous eye is the one that looks and says, okay, I see that person's need, and I'm going to do something for them. I'm going to try to help them. He said the generous eye will be blessed, but then he goes on to explain part of what this involves. He gives of his bread to the poor. Now, is generosity versus greed a very important topic to Solomon? Chapter 11 and verse 25 says, the generous soul will be made rich, and he who waters will also himself be watered. In chapter 19 and verse 17, he who has pity on the poor lends to the Lord, and he will pay back what he has given. In chapter 21 and verse 13, he says, whoever shuts his ears to the cry of the poor will also himself cry and not be heard. I would suggest to you that what Solomon is trying to impress upon Rehoboam is that you need to be a person who looks at others with a compassionate eye and sees their need and does something about it. What's that? He failed. He did. People sometimes look at other people's needs and they constantly make excuses to say, well, this was their problem, that was their problem. But there are many people who are in situations of need through no fault of their own. And like right now, one of the things, I guess my heart is just very sympathetic for the people who live in the Ukraine. And I'll tell you why. Most of us tomorrow will get up and go to work, and we'll be paid for the work. What are those people going to do tomorrow? Survive. That's it. You know, there's no money coming in. Some of the software that I use on my computer was written by people who live in the Ukraine. And I feel for those people, because they can't go down to the bank and get money. Banks are closed. They can't just go down to the grocery store and swipe a credit card or a debit card. Y'all think about that for just a little bit. How much do you use your debit card now compared to cash? And you think about being able to go buy food and it doesn't work. You know, if you go to Walmart and their reader won't read your card, you think, oh, this is frustrating. But you imagine a whole nation going through that right now. Well, I feel for those people who are doing that, and I wish there was some way that you could just be able to hand some food to those people right now who are in need of it. I will tell you that the Winfield congregation in Winfield, Alabama, Brother Mark Posey, I mentioned to him, they are actually trying to raise funds to be able to help get I guess I'm trying to put it the humanitarian needs for those people over there. I know Mark mentioned the fact that he got off the bus to cross over into Poland, and he gave all of his water and all of his food to those people there, and they were just saying, thank you, thank you, thank you. It's just hard to imagine. And his point was we need to demonstrate what we say we believe. Well, the generous eye will be blessed. God will bless that kind of person. Okay, let's go now to verse 10. Cast out the scoffer, and contention will leave. Yes, strife and reproach will cease. Let's talk about that first phrase. Cast out the scoffer. Who is that? Mocks them? Troublemaker? Really, troublemaker carries with it a lot of the idea of it. The New Testament talks about scoffers in 2 Peter chapter 3. He said, in the last days, scoffers will come, and he says, they will say, where is the promise of his coming? All things continue as they were since the creation of the world. They're looking, they're saying, don't worry about the Lord coming again. They're denying the Lord and doing that. Number two, they're ignoring clear evidence. You know, he says this, they willfully forget. How do you willfully forget something? Okay, you can call it an oxymoron or something like that. Willfully forget means that you choose to ignore it. And so they're not even willing to consider all the evidence. Cast out the scoffer. Here's the person who is constantly a source of trouble and difficulty. Are there people like that in this world, scoffers? Okay. And do these people exist in the church? How many of you have ever been to a congregation where you have one of these people in the church? And how do things go when you got one of those people in the church? You can't do anything right. The truth is you can't do anything at all because everything all the time is consumed with trying to placate that person to make them happy. And you know what? You cannot make a scoffer happy. You can't make a person, you can't pacify a person like that. He says you cast him out and what will happen? Contention will leave. Yes, strife and reproach will cease. You get rid of the troublemaker and the trouble leaves. Let me give you some other passages that I think might be helpful here in Solomon's works. In chapter 26, in verses 20 and 21, he said, where there's no wood, the fire goes out. Where there's no talebearer, strife ceases. As charcoal is to burning coals and wood is to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. If you want to stop controversy, you've got to get rid of the scoffer. Now, let me ask you a question. How do you do that? Okay. Titus chapter 3 says, factious, or the King James says, heretic, after a first and second admonition, do what to that person? Reject, knowing that such a person is self-condemned. You didn't do it. He did it to himself. When you have a person who does create this kind of difficulty, would it be appropriate for a church to withdraw fellowship from a man who refuses to stop creating trouble? Yes. And if a person is a scoffer, they're a constant source of troublemaking. Now, we're not talking about a person who's standing for the truth. We're not talking about a person who's trying to make sure that right is right and wrong is wrong. We're talking about a person who is just constantly creating trouble and difficulty. Generally, it's been my observation, it's done on the basis of personality. I want my way. And if I don't get my way, I'm going to go to this person and this person and this person, and we're going to get a group of people and we're going to go challenge the elders and we're going to tell them, we don't like the way where it's being done because I really want my way. I don't like your way. I've seen that lots of times. And generally, when you got good, solid elders, you know what happens? They're like, no, we're not going to do that. That's not the way decisions are made. And but I remember years ago, the Gospel Advocate used to print on the back page of every week's thing various people who would go and hold gospel meetings, and they'd say, you know, we had 14 editions, or we'd had 12 editions. And then one guy posted in there, we had like 12 editions and 2 subtractions. And we had a very good meeting. Well, maybe that's some subtractions might actually be good, mightn't it not? That's tough to do, isn't it? Ask somebody to leave. But if they are a constant source of pushing error, or they're a constant source of creating conflict between brethren, then certainly they have, Leonard?
Anytime you got a problem, if it's church, business, ball game, or whatever, you ain't got to preach on it. You change it, put up with it, or get rid of it. That's all they're doing.
Yep, that's it. You got to do something with it. You can't allow it to continue on. And in doing this, I think that what Solomon is really looking at here probably is from a national perspective, is cast out the scoffer and contentions will leave. You've got to get rid of the undercurrent elements, and I think the same thing would be true in the church and in society, or maybe in business as well. Anybody else have anything? It's just about time. I hate to move to verse 12 or verse 11 because there's a whole lot in that about being a true friend to the king. Anybody have any comments on any of these? Mm-hmm. When Jesus talked about, being the vine and we're the branches, every branch that does not bear fruit, he does what? Cuts it off, that it may bear more fruit. So that's the idea of it. Well, Lord willing, next week we'll pick up with verse 11, and that's about all the time for today.